The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window, casting a warm, golden glow over the worn linoleum floor. The aroma of sizzling butter and sweet batter filled the air, creating an atmosphere of cozy anticipation. Dan walked into the kitchen, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and paused to take a deep breath. He looked toward the stove where the cooking was underway. For once he came in there, and something smelled exceptionally good. It was a refreshing change from the usual chaotic mornings. Becky turned from the stove, a spatula in her hand and a wide smile on her face. She explained that it was Beverly Rose's very first day of kindergarten. She wanted to do something incredibly special for her daughter to mark this momentous occasion. Because of that, she was preparing a special batch of Captain Crunch pancakes, complete with fluffy whipped cream and fresh, ripe strawberries sliced neatly on top. Dan chuckled, leaning against the counter as he watched the culinary preparation. He remarked that it sounded like a good idea to get the little girl completely jacked up on sugar first thing in the morning, and then immediately hand her off to her unsuspecting teacher for the rest of the day. It was a classic parenting strategy, executed with humorous timing. As Becky began searching through the freezer compartments, her brow furrowed in confusion. She looked around the kitchen and asked aloud where the package of frozen strawberries had gone, as she was certain she had placed them there. Jackie walked into the kitchen, moving a bit stiffly and holding her shoulder with a grimace. She admitted that she had been using the package of frozen strawberries as a makeshift cold pack in bed the previous night to soothe her incredibly sore shoulder. Becky sighed, rolling her eyes affectionately at her aunt. She pointed out that if anyone in the house needed a cold pack, they should use the frozen broccoli instead. She joked that using the broccoli was the only actual reason they ever bought it in the first place, since nobody in the family ever seemed interested in eating it. Jackie shrugged carefully, trying not to agitate her injury. She explained that she simply did not like having broccoli that close to her mouth, even if it was wrapped in plastic and meant for external healing purposes. But she conceded the point and promised to keep it in mind for next time. The big day had finally arrived, and the house was buzzing with a unique mixture of excitement and nervous energy. Darlene strolled into the kitchen, carrying a small, rectangular object wrapped in a simple bow. She announced to the room that she had a little present for Beverly Rose to celebrate her milestone. Becky leaned over to look at the gift, her expression turning into one of pure amusement. She gasped dramatically, pointing out that Darlene was giving the poor 5-year-old a pencil case. Darlene defended her choice with a straight face, explaining that it was her own old pencil case from her school days. She turned it over to show the faded, bold lettering printed on the side, which read, "Trust no one." It was a rather cynical piece of advice for a child entering kindergarten, but it perfectly captured Darlene's distinct sense of humor. Meanwhile, Leo, the brilliant but shy 14-year-old inventor, sat at the kitchen table adjusting his square-rimmed glasses. His messy, spiky brown hair stuck out in every direction as he focused intensely on a small mechanical blueprint. He adjusted his teal hoodie and patted the pockets of his forest green utility vest, ensuring all his mini-tools were in place. Beside him sat Gizmo, the large and intelligent mixed-breed dog. Gizmo's white and earthy brown fur shone in the morning light, and the heart-shaped patch of dark brown fur near his ear twitched as he listened intently to the family conversation. The cookie-shaped white fur patch on his nose wrinkled slightly as he sniffed the sweet aroma of the pancakes, his dark brown leather collar jingling softly. Kira, the bold and energetic 12-year-old adventurer, burst into the kitchen with her high ponytail bouncing. She was wearing her favorite mustard yellow adventurer jacket and a bright cherry red bandana tied neatly around her neck. She looked at Darlene's gift and laughed, noting that it was definitely an unconventional way to start school. Dan looked at Jackie, who was dressed in an unusually sharp and stylish outfit. He whistled softly, asking if she was looking to hit on the kindergarten teacher. He teased her by saying that her strong car wash perfume practically screamed a message of buying her a sandwich, and she would be theirs forever. Jackie sniffed defensively, adjusting her collar. She explained that she simply wanted to make an excellent first impression on the educator. She added with a wink that if the teacher happened to be incredibly rich, single, and only teaching to ease his own inner guilt about having too much money, that would be a fantastic added bonus. Darlene laughed dryly, pointing out that Jackie was clearly trying to suck up to authority. She asked if Jackie realized that such behavior sent a specific message to the child, teaching her to manipulate situations rather than just being herself. Jackie strongly disagreed, stating that there was absolutely nothing wrong with trying to be the teacher's pet. In her view, a person had to work the system to truly succeed in this world. Darlene smiled knowingly, asking if that philosophy was the exact reason why Jackie always dressed up precisely like her own teachers when she was a young child. Jackie stood tall, defending her childhood fashion choices. First of all, she asserted, she looked absolutely fantastic in those classic knit separates. Furthermore, she noted that her strategy worked beautifully because her teacher loved her immensely. In fact, Jackie claimed she managed to double her personal wardrobe after the teacher's husband left her, at which point the teacher's primary new love in life became eating pie, leaving plenty of extra clothes for Jackie. Darlene changed the subject, asking when Beverly Rose was practical coming upstairs, as she was fully prepared to document every single moment of the big day with her camera. Becky found the gesture genuinely sweet, expressing her gratitude for the family's support. Darlene explained that she simply wanted Beverly Rose to have beautiful, positive memories of her very first day of school, which was a sharp contrast to her own childhood experience. Darlene recalled that her own mother had told her she was far too plain looking to be naturally liked by others. Therefore, her mother instructed her to put on a skirt when playing outside. That way, when Darlene climbed all the way to the top of the jungle gym, she would at least be guaranteed to be popular with all the boys standing at the bottom. Jackie listened, shaking her head at the memory. She remarked that the jungle gym strategy had not worked out as planned. As a backup measure, her mother made absolutely sure that Darlene carried a thick wad of $1 bills in her pocket to pass out on the playground, ensuring that the other boys would actually stand around and talk to her. Becky summarized the scenario with a grin, noting that it sounded like the exact historical opposite of being a stripper. Instead of taking off clothes to receive money, Darlene was showing her underwear and actively giving the boys cash. Darlene pointed at Becky, agreeing completely that the summary was entirely accurate. Turning her attention back to the school preparations, Becky announced that she was putting a sweet handwritten note inside Beverly Rose's lunchbox. Jackie watched as Becky carefully crafted a sandwich using a cookie cutter. Becky held up the final product, showing that she had made the sandwich in the exact shape of a heart. She asked the room for an honest opinion, wondering if the message she wrote was perhaps a bit too overwhelming for a 5-year-old. The note read that when Beverly Rose ate the sandwich, her mother's heart would literally be inside her tummy for the entire day. Darlene leaned forward, stating that she knew this morning would be an incredibly emotional experience for Becky. Because of that, Darlene explained that she had completely cleared her busy schedule for the morning so she could ride along in the car to the school, offering her full emotional support. Becky looked at Darlene suspiciously, claiming that Darlene was not actually trying to be supportive, but was instead trying to co-opt her special mother-daughter moment for her own amusement. Darlene insisted that she was fully prepared for the day's events. Suddenly, Beverly Rose walked into the room, looking adorable in her little school outfit. Becky looked at her daughter, and the reality of the moment hit her all at once. She gasped, realizing that her baby was truly growing up and leaving for school. She expressed her disbelief that she would not see her little girl again until noon. Darlene smiled gently, noting that she knew exactly how Becky would react. She playfully offered once more to ride along in the car, mimicking a comforting sound to cheer her sister up. Later that afternoon, the family gathered back in the kitchen. Dan was at the stove, carefully stirring a pot of red sauce. Darlene walked in and watched him, joking that he did know that grocery stores sold regular ketchup, meaning he did not have to go through the immense trouble of manufacturing his own from scratch. Dan pointed his heavy iron skillet toward her, warning her not to make fun of a man who was actively holding a heavy piece of cookware. He joked that he was almost old enough to commit a crime and not care about doing the prison time afterward. Darlene laughed, pointing out that due to his current physical condition, he would have to execute any attack using only his left hand, which she was highly confident he could not do successfully. She noted that his severe shoulder bursitis was clearly still acting up and causing him significant trouble. Dan stubbornly insisted that he would be completely fine, waving her concerns away. Darlene teased him further, remarking that a simple, Stationary Tomato had just soundly defeated him in a physical fight. Jackie stepped into the kitchen, overhearing the conversation. She suggested that she might actually be able to help Dan with his physical pain. She explained that she had recently undergone professional training in the ancient art of Reiki, and many people in her class remarked that she possessed natural healing powers. Dan looked at her skeptically, immediately stating that she was absolutely not allowed to touch him under any circumstances. Jackie reassured him, explaining that her hands would not actually make physical contact with his body. Instead, her hands would simply hover directly over the specific area where it hurt. From there, she would use her internal energy to remove the physical blockage, allowing the body's natural healing process to take place entirely on its own. Dan hesitated but agreed, reiterating strict instructions that there was to be absolutely no physical touching involved. Jackie nodded solemnly, instructing him to close his eyes, take a deep breath, and try his best to relax completely. Dan closed his eyes and stood still. Jackie brought her hands close to his sore shoulder, hovering them a few inches away. She began to move her hands back and forth rapidly, creating a slight breeze. She explained that her hands were currently applying the necessary spiritual vibration to the affected area. Dan opened one eye and looked at her ridiculous movements, bursting into a loud laugh. Jackie told him to stop laughing and to allow the energy in. She warned him that skepticism was the single greatest barrier to good health. She decided that she would simply have to extend the overall frequency of her personal energy and dig a little bit deeper into his aura to get past his stubbornness. Dan verified once more that she was definitely not going to touch him. Jackie called him a big baby and assured him she would not. At that exact moment, Harris walked into the kitchen, stopping dead in his tracks at the bizarre sight. He looked at them and asked what on earth they were doing. Jackie stopped her movements and explained that his grandfather was currently suffering from severe bursitis in his shoulder, and she was merely attempting to heal him using alternative energy methods. Harris shook his head, stating that he did not understand why members of the baby boomer generation insisted on waving their hands around in the air when they could easily just use some legal cannabis to solve their physical ailments. Harris admitted that he personally used it every single morning to loosen up his muscles before exercising. He then confessed that he usually ended up not exercising at all, choosing instead to spend the rest of the day watching internet videos of people falling down, but he still felt absolutely fantastic regardless. Dan immediately rejected the idea, stating that his body did not need any more foreign substances thrown into it. Jackie agreed, adding a dramatic comment about how Dan's old, weathered veins could barely transport his regular blood as it was, so adding anything else would be a terrible idea. Dan snapped at them, telling them to knock off all the comments regarding his advanced age. He revealed to the surprise of the room that he actually used to smoke weed back when he was in high school, specifically during the time he injured himself playing competitive football. He added with a chuckle that he had completely forgotten about that period of his life, precisely because he used to smoke weed back in high school when he hurt himself playing football. Darlene pointed out that his high school days were a very long time ago. She reminded him that in the present day, he drank like a fish, ate terrible food, and absolutely did not need to throw any more trash onto the metaphorical environmental landfill that he called a human body. Harris intervened, explaining that the cannabis available today was completely different from the low-quality material of the past. He explained that one could simply walk into a modern, legal dispensary and purchase carefully cultivated, clean products. He suggested that it could truly help relieve his grandfather's chronic pain. He officially proposed that they all take a family trip to the local dispensary. Dan thought about it for a moment and agreed to the trip. Jackie immediately volunteered to go along with them. She explained that they would definitely need someone with real street smarts who could fluently speak the local counterculture lingo. Dan smiled, joking that having her along would be lovely, but he was fairly certain that Snoop Dogg was currently busy baking gourmet cupcakes with Martha Stewart, so they would have to make do without her supposed expertise. Jackie clarified that she was talking about herself being the street-smart guide. She looked at Dan and teased him, saying that he had not even taken a single puff of the jazz cabbage yet, and he was already completely unable to follow a simple conversation. The next morning, inside the colorful and bright classroom of the local elementary school, the teacher stood in front of a small group of children sitting on a circular rug. She held up a large flashcard and addressed the children, asking what specific geometric shape was drawn on the card. Beverly Rose raised her hand high into the air and loudly shouted that it was a triangle. The teacher smiled and thanked her for the correct answer. She then held up a second flashcard, showing a different shape, and explained to the class that it was a rectangle. Becky sat in a small adult chair at the back of the room, observing the class. She leaned over to another parent and whispered proudly that her daughter was truly a chip off the old block. She joked that people should not let the prominent spaghetti stains on the girl's shirt fool them, as Becky herself had been a member of the Honor Society for 3 years running. The teacher looked over at Becky, describing Beverly Rose as a massive underachiever in a tone that suggested otherwise. The teacher then turned back to the classroom, expressing her sincere hope that they would be able to hear answers from some of the other children in the room. She then announced that it was officially cleanup time for the day. As the children began putting away their toys, the teacher walked over to the back of the room and asked if she could speak to Beverly Rose's mother for a brief moment. Becky smiled confidently, stating that she already knew exactly what the teacher was going to say. She assumed the teacher was going to comment on how Beverly Rose seemed to be completely mopping the floor with the competition, academically speaking. However, Becky added that she viewed it as a natural trait rather than a fierce contest. The teacher clarified her stance, acknowledging that the little girl was clearly very bright, but she was also incredibly vocal, perhaps far too vocal for a group dynamic. Becky looked confused. The teacher explained that this initial period was supposed to be a special time for all the little children to not only learn basic concepts, but also to gain some necessary self-esteem. The issue was that Beverly Rose was answering so quickly and frequently that she was not giving any of the other children a fair chance to participate. Becky defended her daughter, suggesting that Beverly Rose only felt entirely free to speak her mind because the teacher had successfully created such a wonderfully safe and nurturing classroom environment. She claimed it was a true testament to the teacher's excellent skills. Darlene suddenly popped her head into the classroom door, making a classic joke about who was there, and answering her own joke by calling the teacher the official teacher of the year. The teacher remained professional and explained that due to the ongoing behavioral issue, she unfortunately had to physically move Beverly Rose's personalized clothes pin on the classroom behavior chart from the green section down to the yellow section. She noted that whether or not a child managed to turn their behavior around for the better was almost entirely dependent on the attitude and guidance of the parent. Becky felt a surge of competitive energy. She looked at the teacher and stated that she was looking directly at a parent who was absolutely fantastic at turning difficult situations around completely. As she gathered her things to leave, Becky looked at the teacher's outfit and added that she genuinely loved the knit separates she was wearing. On the walk home, Becky held her daughter's hand and praised her, stating how incredibly proud she was of her for having such a successful first day of kindergarten. Beverly Rose smiled up at her mother, happily noting that she had answered every single question correctly. Becky nodded, explaining that her participation was exactly what they needed to discuss. She gently suggested that even if Beverly Rose knew absolutely all the correct answers, it might be nice to occasionally stay quiet to give the other children a chance to speak. Beverly Rose frowned, explaining that it took far too long for the other children to think of the answers, and when they finally did speak, they almost always said the wrong thing. Becky explained that it was completely okay for people to be wrong sometimes, noting that the other children could not help it if they were not quite as smart as she was. Beverly Rose nodded in agreement, stating that she had actually told the other children that exact same thing so they would not feel bad about themselves. Becky realized the situation was slightly more complicated than she thought. She explained that if Beverly Rose did not let the other children answer, her clothes pin on the behavior chart would remain stuck on the yellow section, which was undesirable. She emphasized that Beverly Rose was fundamentally a green clothespin daughter, and she was a green clothespin mother. Beverly Rose agreed to try harder. Once they returned home, Becky announced that she had to get back to preparing the school lunchbox. Darlene, who was sitting on the couch, mocked the situation, remarking that a lifetime of intense effort apparently resulted in a green clothespin in life. Becky turned to Darlene, joking that she possessed natural charm and blonde hair, which clearly bothered Darlene immensely. Becky then asked Darlene if she had ever received a yellow clothespin during her own school days. Darlene laughed loudly, revealing that she had briefly passed through the yellow section on her rapid way to receiving a permanent red clothes pin for behavior. Beverly Rose looked at Darlene and asked if it bothered her to receive a yellow clothes pin. Darlene looked down at her niece, admitting that it probably did at the time, but she emphasized that she personally loved knowing all the correct answers. She advised the little girl that if she knew the answer, she should keep right on answering, and if anyone ever instructed her to stop, she should simply shout the answer even louder. Darlene explained to the child that she loved Becky like a sister, but the entire classroom clothespin system was nothing more than a giant scam. She asked Beverly Rose if she felt like she had actually done anything wrong. Beverly Rose shook her head no, but she noted that when she provided too many correct answers, she was not allowed to go to the classroom prize bucket at the end of the day. Darlene comforted her, stating that the true prize in life was knowing deep down that she was excellent, and that the other children who did not know the answers were essentially losers. Speaking of losers, Darlene playfully asked the little girl if she wanted to sit in on a household meeting with a bunch of pathetic green clothespin adults. Later that afternoon, Dan, Jackie, and Harris arrived at the local legal cannabis dispensary. They walked through the front doors, and Dan stopped to look around in absolute amazement. The store was pristine, bright, and filled with modern glass displays. Dan looked around, commenting that the place looked as if the actor Seth Rogen and the fictional character Willy Wonka had somehow come together to have a baby. Jackie agreed, noting that it felt somewhat sad to see the industry become so thoroughly corporate. She reminisced that there used to be a certain romantic, sweet charm about buying illicit substances secretly in a public park. An employee standing behind the counter smiled and asked how he could help them today. Jackie stepped forward, telling the employee to take it easy. She pointed at Dan, stating that while he might look like a decrepit old fool, he had her along for protection. Dan interrupted, stating that he simply needed something effective to treat physical pain. Jackie chimed in, claiming that the real pain came from living in a deeply unjust world where the entire planet was burning up from climate change and society was losing its basic rights to fascist rule. Dan looked at her and clarified to the employee that he was actually referring to a localized physical injury, like a hurt foot. He then corrected himself, stating that the pain was specifically located deep within his shoulder. He told the employee that he used to smoke a little bit back in high school. Jackie nodded vigorously, adding that they both did, describing themselves as a couple of historical hopheads. She loudly informed the young employee that they certainly did not get their grass from some fancy, air-conditioned doobie warehouse back in their day. Instead, they had to physically travel to the dangerous side of the railroad tracks to find a mysterious dealer known as the Doodah Man. Dan ignored her stories, explaining to the clerk that he had already tried a wide variety of products containing CBD, but none of them seemed to be helping his severe bursitis. The employee looked at Dan's large frame, noting that he was a pretty big guy. He suggested that Dan could easily handle some incredibly strong flower. He pointed to a jar, explaining that the specific strain was called Nightmare and possessed an extremely high percentage of THC. He then pointed to another option, explaining it was called Brain Bleed, which was highly potent but allowed a person to still actively play a game of tennis. Dan stated clearly that he did not care about playing tennis. He simply needed a product that would make him completely unable to feel his painful shoulder. The employee reached for a different container, explaining that this specific strain was called I Cannot Feel My Face. He reasoned that if it worked on a person's entire face, it would probably work wonders on his shoulder as well. He then asked if Dan preferred the product in the form of edible gummies or traditional flower. Dan chose the edible candy option. The employee rang up the purchase and informed them that the total price would be $40. Dan gasped at the price, calling it holy crap. He looked around the sleek store and asked if they happened to keep a cheap wooden barrel anywhere in the back, where he could just bag a couple of loose, discounted candies for a lower price. The employee smiled patiently, informing him that the product was definitely not regular saltwater taffy, and they were certainly not standing on the boardwalk of Coney Island in the 1930s. Jackie grew defensive, telling the young man to listen closely. She boasted that she had personally destroyed far more amazing life opportunities with heavy drug use than he could ever hope to experience in his entire lifetime. Harris watched the entire interaction from the side, shaking his head in embarrassment, and quietly remarked to himself that his elders had to be completely high already to be acting this way in public. Back at the family house, Becky was in the kitchen preparing an afternoon snack. She looked down as Beverly Rose ran into the room. Becky told her daughter to go directly downstairs to wash her hands, promising that she would have a delicious snack ready for her when she returned. The little girl nodded and ran off. Darlene walked into the kitchen, looking serious. She stated clearly that she and Becky needed to have an important conversation immediately. Becky sighed, holding up her hand, asking her sister to hang on a moment because she was technically still working from home. Darlene ignored the request, explaining that when she picked up Beverly Rose from school that afternoon, the teacher pulled her aside. The teacher reported that the little girl was currently twice as aggressive in class as she had been the previous day. Becky stopped what she was doing and asked for clarification, wondering if the teacher meant aggressive or simply assertive, noting that there was a massive societal difference between those two terms. She pointed out that previously her daughter was just answering all the questions, which should not be viewed as a crime. Darlene countered, explaining that the behavior had escalated. She stated that Beverly Rose was now actively calling out the other children in the classroom, explicitly telling them that they were dumb. Furthermore, when the teacher threatened to officially give her a red clothes pin on the behavior chart, the little girl looked the teacher dead in the eye and stated that the entire system was a giant scam. Becky could not help but smile a little, remarking that such an observation was incredibly perceptive for a 5-year-old child, and suggested that they should actually be proud of her critical thinking skills. Darlene crossed her arms, asking if Becky realized that Beverly Rose had learned that exact phrase because Becky told her that the previous day. Becky admitted that Beverly Rose had asked her if she had ever received a yellow clothes pin. She explained that the child only asked because she genuinely did not understand why she was getting into trouble just for being smart. Becky argued that all she did was tell her daughter to always be herself. Darlene raised her voice, stating that it was none of Becky's business to interfere with the school's social structure, and she should have stayed entirely out of the situation. Becky grew angry, arguing that Beverly Rose should absolutely never have to hide her natural intelligence. She asked Darlene if she had spent her own life playing stupid just so that random people would like her. Darlene clarified that it was not about playing stupid, but rather about being socially strategic. She argued that angry, confrontational individuals who alienate everyone around them do not get rewarded in the school system or in the real world. Suddenly, the front door opened and Harris walked in, looking completely exhausted. He announced to the room that the local school district had officially appointed him as a school crossing guard. Becky looked at him, asking if he was assigned to the most dangerous street located the farthest away from the actual school building. She asked if he ever wondered why they never bothered to give him a proper reflective safety vest. Harris shrugged, explaining that the school administration had simply told him they ran out of vests, completely missing the implication. Darlene turned her attention back to Becky, stating firmly that asking Beverly Rose to refrain from answering questions in class was fundamentally wrong. Becky strongly disagreed, shouting that it was not wrong. She argued that the girl desperately needed to learn how to successfully get along with other people in the real world. Darlene mocked her, asking if getting along actually meant learning to know her subservient place in society. She expressed her absolute disbelief that Becky had failed to defend her own daughter to the teacher. Darlene reminded her that while their own mother certainly had her share of personal problems, she would have gone down to that school immediately and ripped the teacher's head clean off to protect her kids. Becky countered, noting that when a mother acts that way, you simply end up being the unfortunate kid with the crazy mother, asking Darlene how she liked growing up with that reputation. Darlene admitted that she used to want to crawl into a deep hole whenever their mother caused a scene at school. However, she confessed that it ultimately made her feel incredibly protected and far more confident, which made her a stronger adult. She told Becky that she needed to think long and hard about what specific kind of person she was teaching Beverly Rose to become. Becky scoffed, claiming that Darlene clearly wanted the girl to be less like her mother and more like Darlene, which she stated was the absolute last thing she wanted to happen. Darlene asked if Becky truly believed it was better for the girl to turn out like her. She reminded Becky that she had been so incredibly anxious to please others during her youth that she completely gave up her higher education and left her entire family behind just so she could move away with Mark to the state of Minnesota. Becky stood frozen, deeply hurt by the personal attack. She told Darlene that if she had nothing else cruel to say, she should get out of her face immediately. Darlene turned and walked out of the room. Becky muttered loudly after her, suggesting that perhaps if Darlene were a bit easier to get along with, her employer wouldn't make her work from home all the time. Darlene yelled back from the hallway that working from home was her own personal option. Later that evening, Dan was sitting rigidly on the living room couch. His eyes were wide, and he was staring intently at the blank television screen. Leo and Kira stood nearby, watching him with a mixture of concern and amusement. Gizmo sat at Dan's feet, his intelligent brown eyes looking up at the old man, tilting his head as if trying to understand his strange behavior. Darlene walked into the living room, noticing his bizarre posture. She asked what on earth was going on. Dan spoke in a slow, robotic monotone, insisting that absolutely nothing was wrong. Darlene sighed, looking toward Harris, who had just walked in. She asked exactly how many of the strong cannabis gummies Dan had ingested. Harris admitted that he did not know for sure. He explained the timeline, guessing that Dan took one gummy initially. When it did not seem to work right away, he grew impatient and took a second one. Shortly after that, the very first gummy finally kicked in all at once. Dan then got incredibly hungry from the effects, lost his judgment, and accidentally took a third one. Darlene gasped, stating emphatically that a person should never, under any circumstances, take the third gummy. She walked over to Dan, telling him to sit completely still on the couch and reassuring him that everything was going to be completely fine. Dan looked down at his legs in pure panic, stating slowly that he could not walk. He claimed with absolute certainty that his feet were currently on the wrong feet. Darlene looked confused, asking if he meant that they were somehow not his own physical feet. Dan grew frustrated, asking what was wrong with her. He shouted that of course they were his own feet, but they were currently attached to the completely wrong legs, meaning they were refusing to walk together in a straight line. Darlene decided to play along to calm him down. She leaned down and touched his ankles, announcing that she could easily help him with that problem. She made a theatrical motion with her hands, claiming she was switching them back to their proper places. She then stood up, announcing that the procedure was complete and his feet were back where they belonged. She told him it was time to go for a walk. Dan stood up carefully, moving like a robot. As they walked around the perimeter of the living room, Dan asked how long they were going to be walking for, guessing it would take about an hour to fix the issue. Darlene nodded, confirming that they would indeed be walking for an hour. Dan groaned in despair. Jackie walked into the room, taking one look at Dan's robotic walking, and realized what had happened. She laughed, noting that they had finally experienced the power of the commercial edibles. She warned everyone that those candies were definitely not meant for children. She instructed Harris to go to the kitchen immediately to fetch Dan some heavy carbohydrates to help absorb the substance. Darlene led Dan back to the couch and sat him down. She suggested that they put something relaxing on the television for him, something deeply soothing and familiar to help ground his mind. She picked up the remote control and began scrolling through the menu options. Dan watched the screen intensely. As the menu changed, he pointed frantically, telling her to go back to the very first image. He realized it was just the television's default graphic screensaver, but he insisted that they stay right there. He stared at the moving colors, muttering that nobody should tell him how the story ends. The following afternoon at the kindergarten classroom, the school day was wrapping up. The teacher held up a picture book, asking her class which one of her little students could identify the specific animal shown in the illustration. A little boy raised his hand and guessed that it was a dog. The teacher smiled gently, telling him it was a good try. She instructed the class to look closely at the picture and to read the letters printed underneath. She asked aloud what the word spelled out. Beverly Rose sat quietly in the corner, her mouth tightly shut. She looked at the card, knowing clearly that the word spelled out frog, but she chose to remain completely silent, staring down at her lap. The teacher announced to the room that the word was indeed frog. She praised everyone for a good job and told the children she would see them all tomorrow. Becky walked into the classroom to pick up her daughter. Beverly Rose ran over to her, pointing proudly to her chest. She announced happily that she had successfully earned a green clothes pin for her behavior that day. Becky smiled widely, telling her that it was absolutely fantastic news. Beverly Rose explained that she had achieved this by not speaking a single word for the entire day. She noted that the teacher had explicitly told her that her silence was a wonderful thing. Becky's smile faded slightly. She asked for clarification, wondering if her daughter truly did not speak at all during the lessons. Beverly Rose confirmed that she remained silent, even when she knew absolutely all the correct answers to every single question. She admitted that following Becky's advice had been incredibly difficult, but she was happy because the teacher now liked her immensely, and she had even received a colorful yo-yo from the classroom prize bucket as a reward. Darlene stood in the doorway, observing the interaction. She muttered dryly that the reward system sounded like a complete behavioral nightmare. Becky turned to her daughter, telling her to wait out in the hallway for a brief moment. The little girl happily ran out of the room. Becky then turned around to face the teacher, greeting her with a serious expression. The teacher walked over, smiling warmly. She informed Becky that all of her little students had finally participated in the discussions today, resulting in a much better overall day for the entire class. She praised Beverly Rose for participating in a completely non-disruptive manner. Becky looked at her coldly, asking exactly what she meant by the word participated. She pointed out that according to her daughter, the little girl had simply sat in her chair completely shut down for the entire day. The teacher defended her assessment, explaining that Beverly Rose had been a very lively listener and an excellent observer during the lessons. She smiled at Becky, telling her she had done a good job as a mother. Darlene stepped forward into the classroom, interrupting the conversation. She asked loudly if this was the specific type of person they were trying to raise in modern schools, questioning if society truly wanted girls who were merely good little listeners and silent observers. She looked at the teacher, stating that the school was actively teaching the young girl that if she ever dared to show how intelligent she truly was, she would be swiftly punished for it. Becky looked at Darlene, and a sudden realization washed over her. She turned back to the teacher, her posture growing firm and resolute. She told the teacher that her daughter was currently learning a terrible lesson. She argued that the school was training her to become the type of woman who keeps completely quiet during an important corporate board meeting, choosing to stay silent even if the chief executive officer is explicitly calling a cat a dog. Becky stepped closer to the teacher's desk, her voice filled with conviction. She stated clearly that she did not give a single damn whether the teacher believed she was a good mother or a bad mother. She joked that her child would ultimately decide that question with a professional therapist in 20 years. But right now, in the present moment, her daughter was going to answer questions in class whenever she wanted to, and the teacher would simply have to deal with it. The teacher stared at her in shock for a moment. Suddenly, a look of recognition appeared on the teacher's face. She gasped, stating that she had just realized that Becky was a member of the notorious Connor family. The teacher recalled a specific memory from her own youth, remembering when Becky's mother had famously marched into her third-grade classroom decades ago. She recalled how the mother completely lost her temper at the teacher because Becky's sister, Darlene, had received a D grade on her school diorama project. The mother had shouted furiously, demanding to know how Darlene could possibly receive a D grade on the project when Becky had previously received a perfect A grade on that exact same diorama when she turned it in years prior. Becky looked at Darlene in surprise, then turned back to the teacher with a proud smile. She acknowledged that the story was completely true, stating that the teacher had just experienced a classic Connor family moment. She warned the teacher that the apple definitely does not fall very far from the tree, instructing her to buckle up for the future. Later that evening, Dan was sitting at the kitchen table, looking much better. The effects of the edibles had completely worn off, but he was moving carefully. Darlene walked in and asked how his shoulder was feeling. Dan sighed, admitting that the severe pain had returned. He stated that he might finally have to face the harsh reality that at his advanced age, certain physical pains simply never go away completely. He noted that in his mind, he still felt exactly like the same young guy who played football in high school. However, when he actually attempted to get out of bed every morning, it required a massive amount of physical rocking back and forth accompanied by loud screaming just to gather enough physical momentum to stand up on his feet. Darlene listened sympathetically. She remarked that it was a shame because it sounded like the cannabis had actually worked wonders for his pain relief. She suggested that he could simply select a specific strain that was not too strong and attempt to grow the plants himself at home. She joked that since he already owned a vintage waterbed, setting up a hydroponic growth system was the next logical step in his life. She calculated that he would save at least $40 every week. Dan looked intrigued. Darlene explained that he could easily set up a small growth area inside his bedroom closet, promising to show him exactly how to do it. Dan smiled, joking about the space requirements. He wondered if he would have to move all of his fancy formal tuxedos and his expensive cashmere driving coats out of the closet and relocate them to the washing machine sitting in the driveway. He then laughed and agreed to the plan. He looked over at Harris, who was entering the room, and asked if he would like to participate in growing illegal substances with his old grandfather. Harris smiled widely, adopting a humorous, old-fashioned accent. He joked that such an activity sounded absolutely swell. A few minutes later, Beverly Rose walked into the kitchen carrying a small treats wrapper. Becky saw her and quickly instructed her to go ahead and eat that in the kitchen, but warned her not to let her grandfather see it. She joked that if Dan saw the sweet treat, the legendary clogged artery monster would surely come and get him in the middle of the night. Dan overheard the comment, noting with a grin that a child was eating an ice cream cone right before dinner. Becky sat down at the table, looking exhausted. She admitted to Darlene that she had experienced a completely horrible day. However, she looked at her sister and confessed that she had discovered that Darlene was actually entirely right about the school situation. Becky explained that she was putting down her phone to give Darlene her full attention, admitting that Darlene had made an excellent point that she had initially failed to listen to because she was so incredibly anxious to please the school teacher. Because of her own insecurities, she had accidentally made Beverly Rose terrified to speak up. Darlene smiled gently, telling her sister that she absolutely did not have to apologize. Becky clarified quickly with a smirk that she was definitely not apologizing. She was merely stating the factual reality that Darlene happened to be right. Jackie walked into the room, looking at both of them. She stated that what the entire family had successfully learned from this experience was that Beverly Rose should ultimately grow up to be neither like Becky nor like Darlene. Instead, the little girl would eventually figure out exactly who she was supposed to be on her own terms. Harris chimed in from the counter, suggesting that perhaps the girl would grow up to be exactly like him. Darlene looked at Harris, joking that if a person were to completely strip away all of Harris's deep layers of intense self-loathing and the genuine craziness that chills a person to the bone, they would be left with a wardrobe and a haircut that belonged on a clay sculpture in a New Mexico art museum. The family burst into laughter at the description. Suddenly, Beverly Rose walked over to Dan's chair, holding out a small wrapped treat. She smiled and announced that she had brought her grandfather an ice cream sandwich. She joked that she wanted to stay up to see the legendary clogged artery monster come and get him in the night. Dan laughed heartily, taking the treat. He looked around the room, asking where she had heard about such a monster. He joked, wondering if Becky, Jackie, and Darlene were secretly planning something against him. He teased them, saying that if they were hoping to see the term life insurance monster arrive, he had officially transformed that creature into a mortgage payment monster and a new sewer line repair bill. Dan looked down at the little girl, telling her that he was actually a brand new kind of monster himself. He unwrapped the ice cream sandwich, growling playfully, and told her she was awfully sweet and that he was going to eat her up too. The kitchen filled with the sound of happy laughter as the family enjoyed the warm evening together.